Hi everyone, welcome to session 23, Verbal Behavior. In this section we're going to discuss an extension of operant behavior in terms of the acquisition of a particular type of operant behavior, verbal behavior. This is an area of great concern to many individuals, practitioners who are working with persons with developmental disabilities and pervasive developmental disabilities in particular, in which we have individuals who have difficulty with communication, and we may try to teach ways in which the individual could actually communicate with persons around them, caretakers, teachers, parents, siblings, friends, and so forth. So this obviously has been a very important area of growth, particularly in applied behavior analysis, with the advent of some of the Mandy teaching that came out of Vince Carbone's research, as well as some of the work that Jim Partington did in developing ABLES, and Sundberg had done in developing some of the VB mapping stuff, and folks who do a lot of work in speech and language using PECS and perhaps different kinds of augmentative communication systems and devices and so on. So obviously verbal behavior has emerged as a very, very important area in understanding behavior in general. So we're going to cover this area, and I will mainly go over some of the conceptual issues and some of the ways in which Skinner described various aspects of verbal behavior, some of the functional properties that distinguish between, say, one type of verbal operant versus another type of verbal operant. So we're going to go through this. The Pearson-Cheney book goes into great detail on these topics, and in Pearson-Cheney they actually cover, in addition to verbal behavior, they discuss the Columban Simulation Project, the work of Epstein and Skinner, which we will cover in the next session. And then it also covers some of the work on stimulus equivalence relations, the work of Sidman and his colleagues, and we'll cover that in session 25, I believe it is. Okay, so we got a lot of stuff to still cover, which seems to come under the rubric of verbal behavior, but more in general under the idea that we can now start accounting for much more complex repertoires of behavior by looking at some of the original building blocks relative to reinforcement, discrimination, training, and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and freeze my camera here, if you bear with me for 1 second. And there we go. And I've got my arrow here, and let's go ahead and begin verbal behavior. Now, in Pearson-Cheney, they cover some of the traditional interpretations of verbal behavior, but described in terms of language acquisition and the work of language theorists. So a lot of the traditional interpretations, although there may be a variety of different sorts of interpretations, many of them actually utilize some of the earlier models, psychology models, of dealing with verbal behavior in terms of intervening variables. That is, language comes about as a result of mentalistic and cognitive types of structures, rules that are actually used to help guide language, how we actually use grammar, and these other sorts of things. So when we actually look at some of the traditional interpretations, such as the ones provided by Vygotsky and perhaps by Chomsky, we see, although there are differences, the main thread here is that there is no analysis of a speaker-listener relationship. It's much more what might be going on, as we say, inside the person who is speaking or communicating or engaging in what we might call the use of language. And because of the traditional problems that we talked about in general with these interpretations way back in the very first 2 or 3 sessions, the same thing holds true here as well, is that how do we actually come to understand what it is that people do when they engage in these kinds of behaviors. And we find that many of the mentalistic and cognitive explanations really do not explain anything. They are just simply reinterpretations of facts that we now use to actually turn around and explain the very behavior that we're trying to understand. Again, Pearson-Cheney go into these details, and again, there are many, many problems with this type of an approach. But in general, many of the linguists and language experts who are out there, although they all seem to disagree on what it is that communication involves, the one thing they do seem to have some degree of agreement on is the fact that no matter what you may believe, B.F. Skinner's theory is absolutely wrong. And so in that respect, I guess there is some degree of agreement amongst them. But I think one of the problems here is that many times people really don't understand what Skinner was saying about verbal behavior. Let's face it, this is not a very easy book to really get through. And it was very difficult for Skinner to write. And he had to really do a lot of research and understanding operant behavior in general and this processes of discrimination and stimulus control before he could actually get to the point where he could deal with verbal behavior. Okay? So, what Skinner wanted to propose is not really a theory, and that's one of the things that I think you'll hopefully come to appreciate, if at the very least, where the linguists and language theorists were absolutely wrong. Skinner just simply extended operant behavior analysis. In other words, the experimental analysis of behavior was applied to situations in which organisms operated on the world around them. And we went through a whole lot of explanations and examples of that. As you recall, we talked about one simple operant called opening a door. We went through many different examples of opening the door: pushing, pulling, remote control. It may be something where it's motion detectors that open a door, a floor pad that you step on and opens the door through pressure switches, and so on. But we also said that another way in which we open the door is to ask somebody, please open the door. And we described that type of an operant as a verbal operant, in the sense that although that particular behavior did not contact the environment, it still resulted in the door opening. So Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior really is an extension of what we understand with operant behavior, just applied to a different type of behavior that organisms do. And he looked at verbal behavior in terms of, one, the description. What is the topography of the behavior? Is it spoken? Written? Are they gestures in terms of signing? Are they facial expressions? We could even describe the topographies in which we may phrase a question, and because we put an emphasis on the very end in a particular place, it makes it into a question versus a particular statement. So these are very subtle ways in which verbal behavior by the speaker may affect the behavior of the listener. When it comes to trying to explain why we have verbal behavior, like anything else, why kinds of questions are converted into what are the conditions under which verbal behavior occurs. Okay? And again, we are looking at the variables of which behavior is a function. That is what the experimental analysis allows us to actually do. It allows us to examine some of these variables. And in particular, we know that when we're talking about communication, many of the reasons why we engage in particular behaviors, particularly verbal, depends on the behaviors of the people who we are talking to and how they, in fact, turn around and reinforce our behavior as speakers. So, if we look at Skinner's definition of verbal behavior, what he's really, again, interpreting verbal behavior is simply operant behavior, but it's not a mechanical kind of an operant. There is no pushing or pulling per se. I believe somewhere in his opening chapter, Skinner talks about the idea that rarely do we shout down the walls of Jericho, or do we command the seas to halt, by saying halt. And so forth and so on. These are ways in which we have used metaphors, but we know that these verbal responses that are the result of mechanical control, or what we say operant control over vocal muscles, really do not come in contact with the environment, but they do so in a very different sort of a way. In other words, when we engage in this type of a verbal response, such as saying something or so forth, behavior is reinforced by mediation of other persons. So essentially, we say verbal behavior is any movement capable of affecting another organism. We may consider those things to be actually verbal. The main thing we point out here is that when we talk about verbal behavior, like other operant behavior, There are no references to mental or cognitive states. We need not resort to another level of analysis to account for what it is that people do when they engage in this particular behavior that we call verbal, which is very complex, but it does not mean that we have to have a completely different sort of an analysis to get an understanding of that. So we're going to go over a couple of the variables of verbal behavior, the controlling variables. So we're going to start with the first one called the MAND. Okay? The MAND is a verbal operant in which the response is reinforced by a characteristic consequence and therefore is under the functional control of relevant conditions of number 1, deprivation, or number 2, aversive stimulation. These, by the way, become what we call establishing operations that are important, or what we may also call conditioned establishing operations. I believe that they're called CEOs in the Pearson-Cheney book. So what we see here is a response of a given form is characteristically followed by a given consequence by somebody in the verbal community. Now, that's a fancy way of saying that essentially is that under certain conditions of deprivation or aversive control, a speaker may engage in a particular kind of response to somebody who is the listener, and that listener provides a characteristic response to that particular verbal stimulus. Okay, so words such as requests or commands, and by the way, this is the word where the word man comes from. It is part of the word command or demand, and Skinner just simply describes these things as mands. So in the presence of deprivation of water, we might say water, right? We may, hold out a water glass, which is also a kind of a mand, right? We may point to the glass of water. Sometimes in the middle of conversation, we may actually, at a restaurant, put a glass that is empty to the side of the table, or perhaps a dish that we've just eaten off to the side of the table. All right? In that sense, if having dirty dishes in front of you might be somewhat aversive, we'd like a nice clean place, or the ability to remove something that takes up space so that we could bring on the next portion of food, it may raise an aversive type of situation, and by simply putting that plate over to the side, that is a type of a characteristic mand, even though we are not saying, please remove this, but the characteristics are that when a waiter walks by and sees that, what do? They come by and they pick it up and they take it away. In fact, you could see some very clear, interesting sorts of manding and tacting relationships, speaker-listener relationships, when you do go into a restaurant, because there are very subtle forms of stimulus control that happens there. Okay. All right. Now, again, we have the deprivation of water. We say water. When we're in an aversive event, like somebody actually comes up behind us and puts us in a hammerlock, like used to happen to me all the time in phys ed. Why? That's the consequence of being relatively short. You get picked on a lot. So they come up behind Dr. Kupfer and say, okay, doctor. Well, they didn't say Dr. Kupfer. They say, okay, Jeff, say uncle. And I say, oh, uncle. And then they let go of me. Okay, so in that situation, we see aversive control, say uncle, and they release you. But it could be another form of aversive control. For example, if I have a toothache, I go to the dentist. Now that is a very specific verbal community. And I walk into the dentist's office and I say, ouch, I've got a toothache. Please get rid of it. Right? That is the mand to the people who are there. It's a characteristic mand that's usually reinforced in the presence of people who remove that sort of a pain. Dentist, or whoever is there at that point in time. In other words, that's the characteristic consequence given by the verbal community. That's why when I have a toothache, I don't go to McDonald's holding my gum and say, could you please remove this? That's not a verbal community that's going to be receptive to that kind of a verbal stimulus. Okay? And let's move on to talk more about the mand. It should be obvious that the mand works primarily for the benefit of the speaker. That is, the speaker is usually in the state of deprivation or perhaps aversive control. Again, this is just establishing operations that happen in our day-to-day lives that from one moment to another we don't have something that we really would need to have, or that we have something in our presence that we'd rather not like to have. That makes it aversive. Okay? Mands also can be emitted in the absence of a listener or a verbal community. These are called extended mands. For example, water, water everywhere and not a drop to drink. Now, that's a famous line that came out of what? The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, in which you have a person who's way out in the water and they have salt water all around them, and that's the mantra, water, water everywhere and not a drop to drink. Now, this person is out there, but they're essentially speaking to nobody. That's where we basically have a situation where it's an extended mand. That is, under normal circumstances, when we are deprived of water, we say water. However, in the absence of any verbal community, we may still say water. And we do this from time to time. If I am looking for my keys in my house, and I may misplace them, I may walk around the house and say, where are my keys? And I'll ask my wife, Nicole, do you know where my keys are? And being key deprived, my wife comes up to me and holds it out to me and extends it and says, here they are, dear, you misplaced them again. You need to keep them in a place where you remember where they always are. So in that sense, now I have just been reinforced by a listener, who happens to be Nicole, who happened to have the characteristic response, she knows where I leave things around the house. However, when Nicole's not around the house, I may walk around the house saying, what the heck did I do with my keys? My goodness. And I am engaging in the same behavior of banding and speaking out loud as I would as if Nicole was there. There's only one difference. Nicole's not there. This is what we would call an extended mand, in the sense that even though the response is emitted, it doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be a listener there. We know the origin of that behavior. That behavior happens because in the past, when I've been key deprived, there is a characteristic person in my verbal community who helps me out. It doesn't necessarily mean that that response by me, that mand, has to have a speaker, has to have a listener there every single time. In a sense, we do talk to ourselves. And sometimes we talk aloud. Somebody may say, who are you talking to? And I say, nothing, I'm just talking to myself. However, we will also engage in manding behavior where we do the same thing, except for one thing, our lips don't move. In other words, manding, when we walk around thinking to ourselves, what did I do with this, is the same behavior as it is when we say it aloud. The only difference is that in the one instance, there may be a listener there who's predisposed to respond. In the later sense, there may not be a listener there, but there's enough stimuli in the environment to support the behavior. We'll get back to actually talking about this a little bit later. Finally, a mand is not actually a formal unit of analysis. That is, you cannot understand the mand by just simply looking at the words or the gestures that come out of a person's mouth and say, oh, that's a mand. It's not in and of itself a formal unit analysis because you need to know the variables under which that response is a function, and that usually requires an analysis of the entire episode. In other words, you need to see the behavior of the speaker and the listener. So here's something that's very important that will become apparent in later classes. When you write the behavioral plans for individuals in which you are going to teach manding behavior, that is, teaching them how to ask for things, asking for a break, asking where the bathroom is, asking for assistance, asking for food, asking for many, many different things. These are manding behaviors. If the behavior plan only focuses on the manding behavior of the person who is manding, the individual, you're missing a big part of the behavior plan because you have to have in the behavior plan the consistent behavior of the listener. Because if you don't have a characteristic environment, you're probably not going to have a whole lot of development in manding behavior. Okay? So we need to know the behavior of the speaker and the listener, the consumer and the caregiver, the parent and the child, the patient and the doctor, the politician and his constituency. And again, we could actually have speaker-listener relationships here where the verbal community of the listener is not necessarily one person. It could be a group of people. Okay, therein lies what we call the verbal community. The verbal community can be one person or it could be many people. Okay, very good. Let's continue to move on. We come to the next unit of analysis, which is called the tact. The tact is a verbal operant in which a response of a given form is evoked or strengthened by a particular object or event or property of an object or event. in that sense, Skinner uses the example that this person makes contact with the physical world. For example, Skinner uses the example of, in the old days when, and this kind of tells you how dated verbal behavior is, of a person going up in the elevator and the doors open up. Let's say you push the button for the elevator, the doors open up, and the elevator attendant is there, and they say going up, which kind of essentially tacks the direction in which the elevator is about to travel. Now, of course, we don't have those anymore because it's rare to find a elevator operator who tells you going up, right? That's why we now have supplemental control of stimuli, which basically do that, and we have arrows which telling us, or the button lights up telling us which one is going up or going down. Here's another way to we tact. We might say Bob is on the phone when the telephone rings. We may also look outside and say it looks like rain, in which we are simply tacting something out there of a given form. We see clouds gather, and in the presence of that, we say it looks like rain. Now, that may actually be a mand. We don't know that because we have to see what is the behavior of the listener when it says it looks like rain. That could be a subtle way for the person who's saying it looks like rain. They may be manding the person to bring an umbrella. Okay? Of course, we would end up knowing that when the person says, yes, it does look like rain, and there's no reinforcement there, and then the person says, yeah, it looks like rain. I think we need to bring an umbrella. Could you hand me the umbrella? Okay. And again, this is one of those things that you'll learn about in Pearson Cheney, where they talk about how do you know the difference between a mand and a tact. And again, that goes into detail in the book on that. All right. So the tact is very similar to the three-term contingency. In the presence of the stimulus, you say the response, and you may get verbal reinforcement by the person. If you all remember the thing, the game called See and Say, that is, you have the little thing which has the alphabet A through Z, and you point the thing onto the different letter, and might say B. And then you pull the string and it says B stands for B, and then you hear a buzz. Or you hear C. C stands for cat. Okay? The person may be actually learning tacting under those particular conditions in terms of what the sound is that a cat might actually make. Okay? And the child says that is a kitty cat, because the child has learned in the presence of that particular stimulus condition, that in the presence of that, when they say that is a cat, the parent says, very good, that's a good response. Okay? Now, the presence of a given stimulus just simply raises the probability of occurrence of a given form of that response. In that sense, tacts are under unique control exerted by a prior stimulus. And again, the book goes into the details about the fact that these are usually nonverbal stimuli that we're talking about right here. Okay, control is established by the verbal community, but it's based on a type of stimulus in the environment. You can have also something called generalized tacts, what Skinner called extended tacts, or generic tacts, or what he called metaphorical extensions, which account for the creation of novel responses. And we're going to go into more detail on this when we get to radical behaviorism, in terms of talking about how we come to learn to talk about and tact behavior that is what we call private events. Many of the things that we learn when we are learning to tact are actually tacting public stimuli or public events. These are things outside the body. We learn to name or label dogs, cats, stereo equipment, football teams, all these sorts of things, movies, mysteries, adventures, sports. That's football, that's a baseball, that's a basketball. Sometimes children might have the stimuli are too closely associated. For example, a basketball might actually easily be called a volleyball and vice versa, until at some point in time there might be a discrimination in terms of color, size, and so forth, which are just simply finer forms of discrimination training that we go through to teach people. It's probably easier to teach the difference between a football and a basketball than it is a volleyball and a basketball. Or by the same token, it might be easier to teach the difference between, say, a tennis racket and a ping pong racket based on size differentiation. But you now take a look at a badminton type of I'm blanking here, racket, and it might be a little bit different. Okay, so again, these are how we learn discrimination such as these things. But in a sense, we could also learn a tact for a novel response. Skinner uses a very interesting example of this with his own daughter, in which the public stimulus that Skinner shaped up a response to was drinking soda water. That is, if you go to Coney Island or you go to a place in which you have soda water where you have ice cream sodas, right? The typical response to soda water is the fizz that's in it. You see the effervescence. And when Skinner's daughter was drinking that one time, she felt the stimulation on her tongue, which Skinner was able to see the stimulation only in the sense he didn't see the liquid on the tongue, but he saw through the straw the liquid going onto the tongue, and her verbal response was, "That feels funny on my tongue. That feels kind of fizzy." And that's the simple type of way we say, yes, that is a fizzy kind of response that happens from drinking soda water. So the extended tact, or the metaphorical extension, comes when later on at some other point in time, Skinner's daughter is sitting at with her leg crossed perhaps, and when she goes to stand up, she finds that her foot is asleep. And we all know that stimulation you get when your foot is asleep. It feels sort of tingly, right? It feels sort of like little needles are going on in there. These are ways in which we use a metaphor, needles, tingly, to describe that very sensation that nobody has access to. But what Skinner's daughter actually said, which was interesting, was that my foot feels like soda water. See, there's the creation of a novel response that Skinner's daughter learned, in the sense that she first learned the public emission of the response tingly to a public stimulus, and Skinner was able to reinforce that response. But now she used that same type of public stimulus and situation to describe the private event. And here's the interesting thing. Skinner did not reinforce that behavior. That behavior emerged without reinforcement. And in that sense, it was truly a novel response. And we see these novel responses happen many, many times in human behavior, and in particular with verbal behavior. Now, this presents an interesting problem of sorts for the behavior analyst, in the sense that if there is no conspicuous reinforcement, how do you account for the particular behavior? At least this is one of the challenges that was always thrown at behavior analysis when novel behavior came about. That is, that really presents a challenge for reinforcement theory, because a behavior emerges in the absence of any conspicuous reinforcement. Now, for a long time, that created problems until we started looking at the origin of novel responses. This is going to be the topic, by the way, that we talk about after this session when we get into the Columban Simulation Project and Sidman's work on stimulus equivalence relations. You're going to see that we can now account for novel behavior in which behavior is not reinforced, and we know exactly where it comes from and where it doesn't come from. So in that sense, we know now that you do not have to provide conspicuous reinforcement in order for novel behaviors to occur. They're still very predictable, and we have ways of knowing how to actually have these behaviors come about. And again, the most important thing here is that when you see these creative responses and you do not have an explanation for it initially, this does not justify the creation of mentalistic and cognitive structures to explain it. Just because you can't account for it through reinforcement does not justify these other uses, because cognitive accounts do not account for it either. These are just nothing more than words that explain the same sort of thing. And you really can't use reification in science. On the other hand, we now can actually account for the emergence of novel behavior, of what we call the linking together or the interlinking of various reinforcement contingencies that now happen in verbal behavior. There are a couple of other verbal stimuli that evoke verbal responses. The first one we're going to talk about is called echoic behavior. And echoic behavior involves a one-to-one correspondence between the stimulus and response. Okay, and you might have actually experienced this. I remember in school, elementary school, in which they used to have learning Spanish on public television, I thought it was just an excuse for the teacher to actually turn the TV set on for about 1 hour while the teacher ducked into a meeting with the other teachers in the lounge and talked about other things while the students were preoccupied. Well, it turns out it was probably a good learning experience because I did pick up Spanish even though there was no teacher there. And what used to happen is that you'd have somebody come on TV and say, say something in Spanish. They may say, "Buenos dias." And then they make a hand gesture to you, and you are supposed to say, "Buenos dias." And you're supposed to repeat exactly the same thing the person did. Now, we do this with children. We might say apple in the presence of apple, and the kid says apple. We are trying to teach tacting, obviously, in this situation, but when the verbal stimulus, in this case, is just simply a verbal response saying, "Say apple," and the child says apple, and there are no stimuli there, we are simply doing echoic behavior. We might say, say hello. Hello, very good. So we are actually seeing the one-to-one correspondence between the response of the speaker and the response of the listener. That's what makes it echoic, is the sense that it is a one-to-one correspondence between stimulus-response. It need not be the fact that it is actually a vocal response that you say and I say. Echoic behavior could also happen with written stimuli. If I write something on the blackboard and I write down a phrase, and you write down exactly what I write down on the blackboard, that's echoic behavior. Why? Because the stimulus is in written form, and you write down exactly what I write down on the blackboard, and the stimulus and the response are in the same modality, that is a one-to-one correspondence. That's what makes it echoic behavior. So again, echoic behavior involves a situation in which there's that one-to-one correspondence. Make sure you're not mistaken by the fact that it's not the fact that it's echoic that it means that it's verbal because we have an echo. Right? You get on the mountain ledge and you start yelling or yodeling and it comes back to you. That's not what makes it echoic because you hear it. The thing that makes it echoic is the one-to-one correspondence. Okay? The next type is called textual behavior, in which the stimuli are in one modality, which may be visual, or if the person might actually be doing something relative to using Braille, it might be tactual. Okay? And the response is in another modality. That is, the response is vocal or it's auditory. That is, something is said and something is auditory, or it may be visual, and then you actually read what is written there. And in that sense, books, pictures, and letters involve textual behavior. In other words, they involve text. And in this situation, the speaker is actually a reader if he is under the textual control. Okay? All right. Let's move on. We could also have something called transcriptual behavior. This is the behavior of writing, and when we are actually writing a musical score, we are engaging in transcriptual behavior. We are transcribing as we might actually be playing something on the piano, messing around with the keyboard and stuff, and say, "Ooh, that sounds like a wonderful little chord arrangement. Oh, what a nice little arpeggio." And you pick up a pen and you start writing it down either in actual letter form, which is what I used to actually use because I really was not very good at writing down written notes. So I would write down a chord. If it was an A chord, I might write down A, C, whatever makes a C chord. Actually, a C chord is C, E, G. And I'll just write down there C, E, G. And it goes to an F chord, F, A, C, and so forth and so on. That would be transcriptual behavior. And when a person actually takes that transcript, whether it's letter form or musical form, and they look at it, the stimulus in one form, and they turn around and actually play it in another form, you have transcriptual behavior, but it's actually reading behavior. We are reading music, right? It's in one form, but you're playing it in another form. Transcriptual behavior requires support from an external environment. In other words, it occurs in a medium. You must be writing it down. Text messaging and all those things requires that the text and so forth, you need to have an external medium to support the behavior. And as I mentioned, if both the stimulus and response are written, they may be the same modality, and therefore they are echoic in nature. Now, to kind of help you with getting all this stuff straight, this came out of Catania's learning book, in which he kind of shows you the relationships as they go back and forth. For example, stimulus is acoustic, response is acoustic. That describes echoic behavior. If the form is in written, the stimulus is in written form, visual. The response is vocal, it's acoustic form. Then we say that's transcriptional or textual behavior. This is the behavior of reading a book. Okay. We also see that when it's written, visual, and the response is written, visual, we are talking about transcriptional behavior because you have to have, again, a medium. When it's in vocal form, the stimulus, and it's in written form, this is dictation taking. Okay, so this may be a useful way for you to kind of keep some of these things straight. And again, you're going to see a lot of these things when you get into the later units, or I should say the other classes, in which they cover some of the verbal behavior teaching techniques and process verbal behavioral processes. Okay, and then the last one we're going to talk about really quickly is intraverbal behavior, in which we could have a class of verbal operants that are regulated by verbal discriminative stimuli. Now, there are great examples of this in Pearson Cheney to kind of go through, and they do a really nice job. When it's this, it's intraverbal. When it's this, it's tacting. And they teach you really good ways to discriminate between, is this an intraverbal or is this a tact? At what point does the intraverbal become the tact and the tact become intraverbal? So, for example, word associations are great ways of talking about intraverbal behavior, in which when our response to person says, name a Colorado fish, and we say trout, that would be an intraverbal response. Okay? That's a lot different to seeing a picture of a trout, pointing to it, and saying trout. You see the relationship here is trout is a type of Colorado fish. And of course, there are many other types of Colorado fish that we might actually describe in terms of trout. The type of trout, rainbow trout, cutthroat trout, and so forth and so on. Okay. We also see here that we have a response, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Okay. These are intraverbals in the sense that you have a verbal discriminative stimulus and a clear verbal response, and this response to the stimulus depends on reinforcement history. If you've played the game $20,000 Pyramid, that's very close to actually looking at intraverbals, where they list a whole bunch of different things, and you start going down the list of naming those sorts of things. So they say, okay, this is a type of area of psychology, and then you go through the list and you say, okay, cognitive psychology, no. Social psychology, no. Keep going. Personality psychology, no. Physiological psychology, yes, that's the one. Next one. Okay, and therefore you're actually doing, again, these types of intraverbal kinds of responses. All right, at this point we're going to stop because we have covered, as promised, mainly the terms that we use in verbal behavior that Skinner used to describe the various types of verbal processes and verbal operants that may be controlling behavior. We're going to come back actually later on and talk about a very unique kind of stimulus control over behavior, and in particular how we come to learn to tact private events. And we'll talk about this when we get to radical behaviorism. In the meantime,